Hey everyone, you are listening to Cantus Firmus at the Movies, and I am here with Mike Schellman. You prefer to go by Mike or Michael? By the way?
Mike's good.
Mike's good.
Yeah.
I like it. It's informal. It's friendly. So we're discussing Noah, Darren. Oh, did I say that right? Darren Aaron. Hold on a second. I can't say this guy's name. Darren Aronofsky.
Yes, I think it's Darren Aronofsky.
The two Aarons back to back messed me up. So I think it was made a few years ago. It's a relatively new movie with Russell Crowe and Jennifer Connelly's in it, and Anthony Hopkins has a piece. And I didn't watch Harry Potter, so
Emma Watson.
Emma Watson, who plays Hermione Granger, right? So so before we get into it too much, I thought I'd sort of introduce Mike and try to get a sense of what he's going to be bringing to the table for the conversation. And so maybe I'll first just kind of ask Mike, maybe what a good question to start would be with, like, what's your educational background?
Well, let's see. Most recently, I graduated from Bethel Seminary in 2007 with a MDiv in Biblical Studies, Greek and Hebrew track. My focus was on the whole Bible, Old and New Testament. And before that, I have a undergraduate degree in English literature.
Cool. So an MDiv is the Master of Divinity. So if you wanted to go further, you would have a demon. You'd have a demon, right?
Yes, a demon.
Yeah.
Yep.
I always thought if I were to get a doctorate of ministry, I would want the degree to say he hath a demon.
They'd say that at your when you come up.
Yes.
To get your diploma.
Yeah, I think there's got to be somebody who does that, but I don't know. Some school that doesn't take itself too seriously. Mike, so we kind of found each other because I think you'd read something I'd written called Open Source Jesus, and you'd been working on some similar kind of related stuff related to I think the church and the idea of what's the word I'm looking for? Emergent.
Yes. Well, here's the thing. Okay, so to kind of give you the full story, my second semester at Bethel, I was starting my theology courses, 101, 102, and I had forgotten to fill out my paperwork for my student loan, and I thought for sure that I didn't, I couldn't. It was too late to get it approved. So what I ended up doing was just taking the theology class, and I could pay for it by myself, and the one class, and then I decided I was going to write really good paper, and I was interested in the question of ecclesiology, because I had gone to this church that was kind of more of an organic church. It was the people there had started it. They were from the 70s Jesus movement.
And to clarify, so ecclesiology is like the study of the church or doctrine of the church, and organic churches are the kind of like leaderless house church style.
Yes. So I'm throwing all this lingo out here, and church lingo. Organic church is kind of DIY church, do it yourself. Yeah.
But it's kind of consistent with the idea of like an emergent church, emergent properties within church. This idea that church doesn't happen because people in power or the leaders of the church make it happen. It's something that develops organically and sort of comes out of the people who are in it coming together and who are filled by the Spirit. Something like that.
Yes. Yeah. And so I kind of wanted to look at the question of ecclesiology and what makes the church, and so there was this term floating around, the emerging church. It sounded interesting. I had never read anything about it. I didn't know any of the figures that were involved. So I just, I got on Google and I started Googling emerging church, emergent, stuff like that. And I found some of the books by the, people that you would expect to find. Doug Paget and who's the big guy? I forgot what his name is.
McLaren? Brian McLaren?
McLaren, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, he had a book called everything's slipping my mind now. Anyhow, but what I found along with that was this article called it was by Eben Moglen, who was the one of the chief lawyers for the free software movement.
Mm-hmm.
And so he wrote a number of papers, defending the free software movement. And in it, he makes this argument about incentive, and he says that that people think about creative works needing to be incentivized monetarily. And he says, money is actually a pretty lousy incentive, because it has no direct relationship to the work, and and so he kind of brought this idea of incentive, and he said it's like he called it Moglen's corollary to Faraday's law. And he said if you wrap a magnet, Faraday said if you wrap a copper coil around a magnet and spin the magnet, it produces current. Electricity is an emerging property of this system. And he says if you wrap the internet around the earth, you spin the globe, which creativity flows in this network of people who are connected to each other, because creativity is just something that people do when they interact with people and when they get ideas from other people, and and then this whole open source movement is this kind of this trust in the ability of people to kind of come together and solve problems, because everyone has needs and everyone has skills, and when you kind of put them together, it just sort of generates the things that you need. Incentive, kind of monetary incentive, kind of ends up getting in the way sometimes of that interaction. And that's another thing that he kind of argues a lot, is that what happens when you put proprietary interests into that system and you block cooperation of people, you don't protect creativity, you hurt it. I don't know. I'm not repeating it exactly the way he said it, but I thought it was an interesting argument.
Sure. Well, I think, Bill Gates had famously said, people aren't going to work on software for free, and I think the example he gave was, no one's going to create an entire operating system if no one's getting paid. And yet we have hundreds of Linux distros out at this point that proved him wrong on that point.
Just tying that back into church, kind of went off on a long tangent. So as I read that argument, I thought, this is what church should be like, this kind of like spontaneous generation of community from something. The direction I kind of take it is that from the proclamation of the gospel.
So now if somebody was interested in kind of hearing or reading more about your thoughts on that, is there a website or anything like that where people could look you up or get a hold of you?
Well, they could always email me or Facebook me. The blog that I have up right now is mschellman.blogspot.com. And Schellman spelled Schellman.
Okay. And if they wanted to find you on Facebook, they would just look up your name, Mike Schellman?
Yes. And same with the email. I'm at yahoo.com.
So
Mike.Schellman. Yeah, Mike.Schellman at yahoo.com.
Great. So now for the film, when we kind of talked about, I sort of let you know, I was kind of thinking about doing this, and you talked immediately about Aronofsky and his films, and that kind of led to us talking about Noah, and because the other, so I've already done one of these so far, and the person I did it with, Nick Quint, he picked a movie called Sin City, which was an interesting choice because it does deal with theological content, but in a way that I guess seems less explicit than a movie like Noah, which is considered a movie about religious topics,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also been very controversial, including in religious circles. And so I thought this would be a really interesting one to talk about while we're talking about theological themes in films. And so I thought I might ask you to start with what is it about Aronofsky and this film in particular that sort of interests you or appeals to you?
Well, yeah, I think what I like about Aronofsky is that he always seems to quite often he's dealing with spiritual issues in his movies. Spiritual questions. They're thoughtful movies. They get you thinking about um, spiritual questions, and I like those.
Was there anything in particular that interested you about Noah? Why do you think it would be a good film to discuss for kind of theological and philosophical themes?
Okay. Well, first, just from a just from a Christian moviegoer perspective, I really liked the movie Noah because it portrayed spiritual things that you might read about in the Bible as real, realistic, not realistic, as real things. So you had these you had angelic beings in the movies, or in the movie that were actually portrayed, um, instead of kind of like, oh, uh, portraying it in a way that was instead of portraying it in a way that was more believable to modern sensibilities, it was portrayed in a way that kind of represents just I'm going to get myself into trouble here. It portrays it the way that it was, the way the account goes,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And when I say the account, I'm not talking about just the biblical account, um, because that's here I get into trouble because well, that's more to talk about. um, but I liked it because it portrayed Noah as a complex character. He wasn't just. It wasn't just. Let me put it this way: you can do a biblical movie in a way that makes all of your evangelical audience happy by portraying it so you can get an idea of what it must have looked like, and then you feel kind of like, it's almost like a reward for your faith. You believe without seeing. You didn't see these things, um, but because you know the story and because you believe it, I'm going to portray it for you. And then it's kind of like seeing. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, um, oh yeah, it could have happened that way and could have happened just like that, um, without addressing any significant questions. Just to me that just seems like pure candy
Mm-hmm.
in a way. It's like I'm going to I'm going to reward you for believing by showing you something that makes you feel like, well, yeah, that could have happened. Um, you're able to put it in a movie and it could have happened. Um, but you walk away without thinking about any really important spiritual questions. And I think what Aronofsky does by importing some of these extra biblical accounts of Noah that include like these angelic beings, the Watchers,
Mm-hmm.
uh, by having Noah be a conflicted person who he gets revelation from God, but he also misinterprets it and kind of in a bad way, and actually has a real possibility of doing bad with this word from God, doing real evil, and has to be corrected. And that's something that Christians are kind of taken aback by. But I think it's actually an important question that needs to be explored. It's like, can you have real revelation from God yet still get it wrong? That's an important question.
Yeah, and actually, and I kind of liked what you said too about it feeling a little bit more realistic or more grounded. And I think the problem with the so-called Christian movie industry is that there are two types of characters. There's kind of the mean, miserable non-believer, and then then they sort of have this come to Jesus moment, and then they sort of become these kind of ethereal Stepford wife type characters. I think that's not anybody's actual experience with faith.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean that there's not a sense of peace or a sense of joy that comes with faith, but it's not like you are this completely miserable person and now everything is fixed. There's complications, there's pain, there's suffering, there's times of where you're unsure, if not of God's existence, at the very least of his presence or his love, and I think this film portrays faith in a way that is more down to earth, that's more realistic, which I thought was one of the things that made it very interesting to me.
Yeah.
And it doesn't it neither mocks it nor does it make it seem simple. And I think for that reason, this movie as well as they would have liked among both secular and believing audiences. Maybe before we get into all this sort of discussion of the theological, ideas and themes that are there, it might be helpful to give a basic plot outline. And I'll note to begin with that we are going to have some spoilers here. So if you haven't watched it and you're interested in watching it before you listen to this, you might want to go ahead and do that. So the idea that we sort of start with is that humanity's corrupted. Noah knows that he's supposed to build an ark because God is going to destroy the world with the flood, because Noah's been given a vision of that. But he hasn't been given direct words from God. His vision is confirmed by Methuselah, who is his great-grandfather, I believe. And, that Methuselah seems to have a sense of what Noah's seeing and what it means. Noah's going to bring his sons on board with him, and he's going to find wives for two of his sons that haven't hooked up yet and aren't hooked up yet, and decides not to. The son Shem, who's going on with his sort of girlfriend, who was someone that Noah had kind of adopted after her family and her village had been slaughtered when she was still somewhat young. She's also barren. But Noah comes to this conclusion that humanity is so wicked, not just the people who aren't going on the ark, but that the wickedness that's in everybody, including him, that if God's wanting to destroy the world because it's so wicked, God must not actually want humanity to repopulate, because they're just going to do the same thing. And so Noah decides that it's his job, or his family's job, to save other life, to save the animals. And that once they get off the boat, they are going to live out their lives and die and not propagate.
Yes.
Then a miracle happens, and Methuselah sort of uses this sort of miraculous healing power on the girl whose name is Ela, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So she is not barren, and she does something sort of adult with Shem before they go on the boat. and is pregnant. So then the complication is that because Noah feels that humanity is not supposed to continue, he's decided that if the child is a girl, he will have to kill it. And the spoiler is that there's two girls, they're twins, and he can't kill them because when he looks at them, all he feels is love and mercy. And he feels conflicted because he feels that he has not done what he was supposed to do, but he couldn't do what he thought he was supposed to do. And so there's sort of a moment where he speaks to Elah afterward, after he sort of is working through all this guilt of what he's done, or what what he didn't do and what he thought he should do, and he sort of eventually concludes that though his judgment of humanity's wickedness is correct, God desires mercy to triumph over judgment, and that there is goodness in humanity because we're made in the image of God. And so he's able to sort of reconcile with his family after reaching that conclusion. Yes, the Watchers. So there are angels who are basically portrayed as benevolent. They come down to help humanity and give them insight and wisdom. And they are punished by God for that by being kind of stuck to the earth in a way. Like they sort of become these, to put it bluntly, they become like these rock monsters.
Yeah.
So their spirits are sort of trapped in all this matter. And they, so anyway, they help Noah build the ark before they're killed by all the people who are trying to get on the ark when the rains start. So maybe just a point of plot clarification before we go into a lot of theological content is that the way that the Watchers are portrayed is kind of interesting, because there are places where they take from Aronofsky and his co-writer, whose name is Ari Handel, take from intertestamental literature, like stuff that was written between the Old and New Testaments, like the book First Enoch, and other writings as well. Jubilees, I think discusses it a little bit as well. And so one thing that's kind of different is the idea of the Watchers comes from Genesis 6, where it talks about the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they went into them, which is a word meaning they had sex with them. And then it says when they went into them, there were in those days Nephilim on the earth, men of renown. And the word Nephilim sometimes is translated as giants, but it seems to mean something more literally like fallen ones. But in Genesis 6, it seems to be saying that the Nephilim are the offspring of these angels and humans. Another reading developed later that I think is less literal and probably less consistent with the text, although what's in the text is such a strange thing, such a strange idea that's never really followed up on, that I understand why people are looking for alternative explanations. So the interpretation that comes later is that the sons of God are actually from the noble line of Seth, and the daughters of men are from the corrupt line of Cain.
Yep.
And what's interesting is Aronofsky seems to borrow a little bit and Handel from both of these ideas, because there is a corrupt line of Cain and there is a good line of Seth. But there's also these Watchers that exist, but there's no indication in the story anyway that they ever have sex with human beings.
Yeah, I think he didn't. I think he made a choice not to touch on that.
Yeah, but he does connect Cain's line with the Watchers.
Yes,
right.
And well, there's actually two...
not physically, but I mean they work with Cain's line. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, there's actually two stories. And they I don't know a lot about this. I'm just actually starting to get interested in and read like Mike Heiser. he just put a book out called Reversing Herman, where he talks about this, including first Enoch in your kind of contextual background of books that New Testament authors would have read from and would have informed what they wrote. And how that helps your ability to understand some more ambiguous passages in the New Testament. But anyhow, there's actually two stories about the Watchers and what they did and what the nature of their sin was like. One was that they helped the line of Cain by teaching them forbidden knowledge. The other is the sexual one that they had Nephilim with the daughters of men, and so I don't know. I think he might have seen that as something outside of the story that he wanted to tell. But I also think it's interesting. There's a story of redemption right there in the Aronofsky's movie of the Watchers. Some people were really upset that they became rock creatures. I just kind of took it as a metaphorical, to pardon the pun, a concrete metaphor. But it was actually taking a biblical idea of fallen angels and making it into a how many biblical movies have you watched where angels actually play a part in the story that aren't like a light from off camera and a voice, that's kind of echoey, or some kind of vision that the person has that isn't connected with the physical reality of their character in the story. It's always an ethereal experience, and I think this movie does a real service to, if not the biblical Noah account, at least the biblical worldview of angels having a real tangible existence and participating with humanity in this kind of biblical story. So they get cast down to earth because now here's what I think is weird is that Aronofsky kind of like, if you've read Enoch, the Watchers, they help humanity, but they're not like sympathetic characters, and I think in Aronofsky's story, they make the mistake of helping humanity, and the humanity actually like they teach humans how to build cities and build an industrial society, and then humans kind of decide to become warlike. When actually I think in the Watchers narrative and stuff, they are the corrupting influence on humanity.
Yeah, there's two specific points that you discussed where the Watchers sort of touch on humanity, at least in sort of the intertestamental literature, has to do with the sex with humans and corrupting knowledge. And Aronofsky undermines those a little, or underplays them, or whatever. Well, I guess I'd say undermines. He gets rid of the first one entirely. There's no discussion of sex with humans.
Yeah. And
the second one, he makes into a well-meaning mistake. And that's not how Enoch, for example, portrays the sins of the Watchers. And, in Enoch, their destiny is destruction, period. But
yes.
for where Aronofsky can sort of, tries to make what they do an honest, well-meaning mistake. And by doing so, he leaves open the possibility for redemption.
And
right?
That was interesting because in Enoch, first Enoch, they ask Enoch to intercede with them for God, to God. and say, please ask God to forgive us. And God says to Enoch, tell them, no, I'm not going to do it. Whereas, in this story, Aronofsky's story, they actually do kind of, they by helping Noah, they redeem themselves and are accepted back into, their rock bodies bust open and their fire spirits kind of ascend back into heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And for someone who's completely unfamiliar with the Enoch and Watchers and stuff, it just seems ludicrous that there's these giant rock creatures helping Noah build his ark and playing such a large part in the story when it's completely unbiblical. But yet, if you look at the bigger picture about what people were believing, and maybe how first century believers would have looked at this these chapters of Genesis, where it talks about the I think it's Genesis 6:1-6, where it talks about the Nephilim in the land and all that stuff. That's they would have been thinking of these stories when they read those passages. Yeah, I did want to tie this to something. I wrote a paper on Paradise Lost. John Milton was doing my English lit thing, and this idea of angelic redemption was something that he thought about too. And my paper was about this angel called Abdiel in Paradise Lost, and I noticed that so he's this angel that fell with Lucifer and was part of this great battle, but he actually repents and is forgiven and goes back to the good side, and that happens exactly halfway through Paradise Lost, and I just thought that was an interesting kind of a thing, because I think the general idea is that like humans have a possibility of redemption, but angels don't. And then Aronofsky kind of asked that question too. I think the reason why he put that in there though, why I think that all through this movie, there's like supposed to be like these clues for us as viewers, but also for Noah, that God's ultimate purpose is mercy, forgiveness. At the very beginning, one of his sons plucks a flower, and he's like, "What are you doing, Shem?" I think it was Shem.
I thought it might have been Ham, but I had it written down as Ham.
Maybe it was Ham. Maybe they were signaling his kind of like later problem child thing. But yeah, so this is what the line of Cain does. They destroy the earth and they take what they want, and they don't give life its proper space to live and grow and all that stuff. That's another thing to talk about, is the whole Christian aversion to the environmental movement.
I've got notes about that. We'll definitely talk about it.
So plucking this flower, he's like, that flower has a right to grow and live on a, and you shouldn't have done that. Anyway, after he teaches his lesson to his son, he's standing there, and the first drop of water falls out of the sky. From, if you're a real fundamentalist, you will believe that this is probably the first time water has ever fallen out of the sky. And so it's perplexing, Anyway, when it hits the ground at this supernatural kind of bizarre, dreamlike rate, a flower blooms in its place. the one that was plucked. And I think I think Aronofsky kind of put that there to kind of like, it's like a picture in miniature of the movie, and how, like the man destroys, the earth, and then God cleanses it through a flood, and then new life springs up. And so it's kind of like this metaphor for the whole movie. And maybe the first sign that Noah should have noticed that God's purpose isn't to just wipe out humanity altogether, but he misses that, but then later with the watchers whose story you had heard, from the beginning of the movie, that they, they fell because they wanted to help man, and now they're encrusted in rock and trapped on the earth, and once man became corrupted, they kind of like distanced themselves from them, and then that kind of puts them in a position where they would want to help Noah. That they're not these bad guys that are on the side of Cain and his descendants. They've abandoned them and kind of been off by themselves for a while, and actually are in a place where they're ready to be forgiven and to help Noah. They don't believe they could be forgiven, but they help him because it's the right thing to do. And then in the process of giving their lives to help protect the ark and Noah and his family, they kind of like get the right to go back to heaven. So that's like another picture of forgiveness in the story. Well, and I think so. I think the whole thing is about mercy and forgiveness, and how people don't necessarily see how that, Noah knows about justice, and he knows about what's right, and all he's expecting is judgment, Yeah. And that turns out that there's more to it than just judgment.
Yeah. Well, and you kind of talked a little about the sort of fundamentalist interpretation, where this would have been the first time it had rained ever. And you do get, well, I don't think that's stated in the film, but if you go into that with that understanding, everybody does seem like it's a very ominous moment when the first raindrop falls, because everybody almost has this sense of like, what is this? Yeah. And I think that Aronofsky, having read kind of a brief interview with him on the topic, I think he sort of looks at this is primeval history. And so, he treats it as if it's, he tells the story somewhat literally, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he takes it as history in the same sense that he would take Abraham's story as history. And so he is sort of willing to sort of go into this world that sort of is primeval in his mind. It's sort of before the real world, I guess, or the world we inhabit. And, the world itself in this film prior to the flood looks very foreign. Everything about it feels strange or off somehow. It feels like it's a different Earth almost. And that changes after the flood is over, and it begins to look more familiar. There are Noah is presented as and his family presented as vegetarian, whereas the line of Cain is not. And that was one of those things that was so kind of funny to hear fundamentalist Christians complain about the film, was all this sort of environmentalist hokum or whatever, and all this pro animal stuff and yada yada. It's like, okay, so but the young Earth position is that humans were vegetarians before the flood, and so it's really trying to, I think, be faithful to a more literal reading of the text and tell that story sort of as it takes place, as a sort of a picture of judgment and mercy. And you sort of maybe that'd be a good place to start. You talked about how the whole thing is about the triumph of mercy over judgment, but you also see that in little visuals like with the flower. That's another thing, is there's such a strong view of original sin and total depravity in this movie. And Aronofsky and his co-writer Handel, I don't know, I'm going to say Handel, but are both from a Jewish background.
Mhm.
And yet the view that they have of depravity, of human depravity, original sin, goes far beyond, I think, the way Jews would look at the issue. It feels very Augustinian.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
which is another thing why, another reason why, there's so many different things as you watch the film that you kind of think, why did the fundamentalists not like this movie? Because
yeah. And his so his use of so normally, like what I'm reading in Mike Heiser, in his books, is that from the Jewish perspective, Genesis chapter 3, where the fall happens, is not the primary thing that people would have been thinking in the first century about, like, why is the world as bad as it is? That they would think back to the sin of the Watchers and how the Watchers corrupted humanity. And Aronofsky, by kind of like changing the Watchers a bit to be more, it was accidental that they didn't intend for humanity to be as wicked as they were. They just wanted to help them out. That sort of puts all the emphasis back on the garden and the fall there.
Well, and two, I mean, Noah has the vision where he sees the evil of these people of the line of Cain and the terrible things they're doing to each other, and he sees himself in the crowd. And so this
crouching down in the dark with like blood on his face from some recent animal he's eaten, I think.
Yeah. So the Watchers don't have an influence on Noah's family. They influence the line of Cain. But what you see in this film is that the evil of the line of Cain is really an evil of degree, because that same evil is in all of us because of Adam.
And I think because the first thing Noah says to the family, it's like, when he's talking about building the ark to his wife, she asks him, "What about us?" Over dinner, they're all eating, and he says, "I guess we get to start again too, like the animals." But then after that vision, I think it's after that vision that he really starts to think that maybe their job is just to make sure that the animals get through the flood safely, and that they're going to be the last humans.
Yeah, and so yeah, and it all goes back to that vision that he has of the wickedness that's in all humans, and I think there's such a strong picture of depravity and of original sin in this film that they're at the conclusion. I mean, you sort of follow through with Noah a little bit, and you sort of feel like, if if humans are that bad, just get rid of them. But but without minimizing to any degree the wickedness that is in human beings, there's this new element that's brought in, which is mercy. And apart from mercy, human sin is insurmountable. It's the final story apart from God's mercy and love. I think there's a line that Naima says when she's talking about wanting why the boys should be able to go on to, we should be able to bring wives on the ark with them, because Noah doesn't want them to. And she says something like, isn't love all that we need to be good? And it is there's one reading of that is a little bit superficial and obviously incorrect, but there's also a sense in which that's very true. It makes a difference in our lives, in our relationships, in our family relationships, but certainly in a sense of holiness and sanctification, it's the love and mercy of God that enables us to be holy, to be good. And so I like that idea that Naima sort of throws out there as a kind of an undercurrent that's running through the film. I did also, Noah deciding not to kill the twins kind of echoed to me the binding of Isaac, or the attempted sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham. And in both stories, God's mercy triumphs over judgment, and they kind of both look forward to Christ as the ark or the coming sacrifice. But it's portrayed a little bit differently in this because in the story of Abraham and the binding of Isaac, Abraham is told to sacrifice Isaac, and then God sort of stops him and says, "No, I've provided the sacrifice." Whereas in this story, Noah comes to the conclusion that God wants him to kill these children, but is mistaken, and it's God's mercy through almost like common grace. It's that image of God in Noah that stops him from being able to do what he's going to do. And so he's dealing with this conflict of what he thinks he's supposed to do and what his heart is telling him he ought to do, his conscience is telling him he ought to do.
Sorry.
Go on.
I was just going to say that I think this is like a perfect picture of I don't know what goes wrong with religious faith so often when people who are Christians are really adamant that they need to do something, but they have it wrong, and God just kind of so Noah gets these visions, and I kind of thought I've thought about this question before. What was it like when someone heard God speak to them? Was there room for doubt? Was it like me talking to you, where it's just really clear, or was it something that could be misinterpreted? And I think if it was something that could be misinterpreted, even if it was like a vision or a voice where it's like, I heard God, but there just wasn't enough detail, and you make up for it with the interpretation that kind of like comes from your context of life, fill in the details, what I know about God or think I know about God, and then extrapolate. And it's like, well, people who heard these things could have been in the same kind of positions that we're today when we read the Bible, and we think we know what it says, and then we go out and try to act on it, and in some cases do some really horrible things.
Yeah.
And then God's throwing these things at him, like to try to say like, no, here, I'm about mercy. Look how I restored this flower. Look how I forgave these angels. Look how your daughter-in-law Hila was barren, but now can have children. Look how you have two boys who don't have wives, but it turns out that she has twins and they're both girls, and and it's like everything here is saying, God's saying like it's about mercy, and he's not getting it,
Yeah. Well, and I think one thing that came up a lot when I would read evangelical critiques, or I keep saying fundamentalists, but I'm talking about a very conservative evangelical approach, because I don't want to say all evangelicals would give this critique necessarily, but that by making God's word not totally explicit, that constitutes a difference from the Genesis account. And I think that that may very well be. However, I think what has happened with this sort of creative license is that a theme which is implied in the ark story, but not really elaborated on really explicitly, is able to be given this very sort of strong representation in the film by making this small change. And that this idea of mercy triumphing over judgment. And it also adds what I kind of have my notes here as this element of misguided piety. Noah represents a lot of religious people who seek to serve the cause of God, but they do great damage and turn people away from God instead. And I found a brief interview with Ari Handel, who the co-writer with a Relevant magazine, where he said the story says that we all have goodness and wickedness in us, and it's up to us to pursue goodness and resist temptation. That's a personal choice that we all have. We can't fall into the trap of thinking those ones are wicked and we are good. That's an easy way out. And, so I think, what I often see in this idea of misguided piety is, and this does, this is not where Noah goes with it, but is this idea that, I'm the one who's chosen by God, and I have a purpose. I'm the good one. I'm in, and these other people are out.
Yeah.
And, that's something I talk to a lot of people who have been turned off to faith or belief in God or Christianity because of an experience of being made to feel like an outsider.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Noah's problem, thankfully, isn't quite that. He's at the very least, he's correct in his assessment of what kind of a person he is and what kind of a person everyone else is, which is, ultimately twisted. But his problem is missing this point of judgment and mercy.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so that was one interesting theme that I thought they were able to explore by making that small change in the story, that maybe it was not something that was stated. It's not like God said take a memo. It was something that was, but also I think the way that it is delivered through these visions also works for dramatic effect in the film as well.
Yeah.
But so and I had a couple more notes on things that I thought were kind of themes in the movie. The first one is stewardship.
Mm-hmm.
And you brought up the idea earlier of him picking the flower and no chastising him, that we take only what we need.
Mm-hmm.
And Noah's family chooses to be vegetarian. Noah sees how humans spoil creation and decides the world will be better without them. And, there's a certain reading of that looks like this kind of hyper environmentalist idea that nature's good and humans are terrible. And I think that's how some fundamentalists saw the film.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Oh, I think it's really interesting. On the one hand, I can really see that perspective about how it's like, fallen wicked man creates an industrial civilization, and the hippie, kind of liberal good guys grow. They're about the growing flowers and not picking them and not eating animals, because they have the same rights that we do, and so on the one hand, I can see how as from a conservative Christian perspective, someone would see that, but then also I kind of look at it like how does this political social and political Christian conservatism kind of prevent you from seeing how this actually takes the biblical narrative seriously.
Mm-hmm.
and says, okay, on the one hand you have the world that God created, and then on the other hand you have the civilization that man has created. Mm-hmm. And so that's on the one hand there's that between like the living creation that God made that has its own life force in it, and then you have the industrial kind of like, he kind of like parabolizes our present world, makes that the context of this story in a way that kind of honors the biblical narrative.
Sure.
But then also the vegetarian thing kind of gets me because I've looked at this. I've thought about vegetarianism before, and have never really been able to do that. But I've read about it, and I've read because there were a lot of like vegetarians in the 70s that kind of like had the picture of Ezekiel with the child with the animals, and there's the Seventh-day Adventists and their promotion of vegetarianism, and
Well, and also let's not forget the fundamentalists, young Earth creationists, who believe that if there is animal death, then the world that God created isn't good, and that humanity was vegetarian until after the flood.
Yeah.
You know.
So if you're really taking the account literally, and you want to have a literal, I mean, this is the only version, a movie version of the story of Noah that actually has the kind of detail, like, of what did Noah eat, you know, what was life like in the world when wickedness increased, you know, what was it like for Noah, you know, and it's like, well, Noah was probably a vegetarian because God didn't permit human beings to eat, you know, to eat animals till after the flood. You know, it doesn't mean that they didn't, but this was the first time that he gave permission for them to. And then you don't have the right to eat animals that have not been part of a ritual in like Israel. I wrote a paper on profane slaughter in Deuteronomy. It wasn't until the Israelites entered the land that they were permitted to slaughter animals and just eat them without them being part of ritual worship in the temple. Like before that, or the tabernacle, before that, you would take your animal, you know, to the tabernacle, and the animal would be slaughtered, and you would get a portion, and the priest would get a portion. Portion was, you know, given to God. And so that, you know, that's a long time without, you know, being able to just, you know, kill an animal and eat it.
Yeah.
You know, so if you take this account literally, Noah probably was a vegetarian.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and really the whole environmentalist, you know, elements in the film come from, I think, trying to take the text pretty seriously on at least 2 points.
Yeah.
I think the first point that it takes it seriously on is that God created the world good. It is humanity that corrupts it. It isn't the animals. It isn't nature in some way. The corruption comes from humanity. So Noah is recognizing this reality. The world God created is good. We, who have free choice, have corrupted it.
Yeah.
So that's a serious reading of the text. And the other element that I think it takes seriously is the idea that the first humans are tasked with tending a garden, and they're given a responsibility to care for it. And this whole idea of stewardship, which is so strongly present in the first couple chapters of the Bible. And, you know, but you have the contrary viewpoint from Tubal-Cain. We haven't really talked about yet, but he's kind of this king of these people who are from the line of Cain. You know, Tubal-Cain presents humans' relationship to nature as one of subduing, that we are to put it under our foot and show it who's boss. And Noah's viewpoint is more that we're to tend it.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think while there's a certain perhaps extreme of that one could reach that sort of minimizes the importance of human beings that you sort of see in the extremist environmentalist perspectives. If you were to pick one perspective to be represented as the more biblical one, I think it would have to be Noah's. But I do think that there's a certain political conservatism and evangelicalism in America that thinks more like Tubal-Cain.
Yeah, and I think I mean, he clearly portrays him as clearly being evil, but it's interesting when he has him talking. Okay, so he sneaks aboard the ark, you know, which is another thing that upsets people a lot. It's like nobody was out. God shut the door and nobody got in, you know.
That's a point of core orthodoxy.
Yes, but this, you know, the way I look at this story is to to get another aside going, this is midrash. This is a way of midrash is a technique where Jewish people who are studying the text would expand the text and talk about other issues within the context of a biblical narrative that doesn't have a lot of detail. They would kind of like fill in stuff. And the way, I guess the closest thing I could think of it is a thought experiment. And if you look at Noah and his getting revelation but misinterpreting it and trying to kill the children because he believes that this is it's exploring within the context of this narrative a real spiritual question and coming up with a biblical answer about mercy. So Tubal Cain gets on the ark, long story short, and he talks to Ham, and this Ham of Noah's three sons, Ham is the one that looks like the one that's most likely to go off and do the wrong thing.
Smoke cigarettes and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so he's been sort of drawn to the dark side from the beginning, plucking the flower and now he's talking to Tubal Cain, somehow to me Tubal Cain getting on the ark is like saying that when Noah brought his family on the ark, they didn't leave wickedness behind. Wickedness kind of came with them in a metaphorical sense, and in a it's like a real metaphor, or like a living metaphor. Tubal Cain is the fact. His existence on the ark is the fact that evil has kind of like come with them, and is currently tempting his son Ham, and he justifies himself when he's talking about he kills this animal, a bird, and starts eating it, and Ham tries to correct him and says you can't do that, there's only two, and life is precious, and then Tubal Cain justifies himself by saying that
there's only one of me.
Only, well, and not just that though, but that was funny. But God gave them dominion, he says, and it's our right as as the rulers of this world, to basically take what we want, to conquer it, to subdue it, and bring it back to what you were saying, the two different interpretations of subdue the earth. Yeah.
Well, it's in one of them, nature matters, we don't, and the other one, we matter, nature doesn't. And neither one of them really looks at humanity as these beings who are sort of given dominion over the earth, over nature, but are tasked to steward it.
Yeah.
And so there's this sort of balance between the viewpoints that I think Noah eventually reaches. But I would say still that even with Noah's imbalance, he's still more theologically correct than Tubal Cain is.
Yes.
Because as an Orthodox Christian, you'd say we don't deserve life, we deserve death because we have sinned and brought sin into the world. And the young earth view in particular would say that animals suffer because of what we did. And they are essentially innocent. And, and I think that the character of Noah takes that seriously, those theological ideas seriously. And, his mistake is not that he is too much of a hippie or that, he's been reading too much Mother Jones. It's that he doesn't understand yet that mercy is meant to triumph over judgment.
Yeah.
And so I do want to say one more thing that's kind of a sort of an aside. We talked about the idea of nature being good and animals, sort of being pure in the film. There's one element, I think, that I wouldn't exactly call it Gnostic, because I don't think the film's coming from that kind of perspective where Gnosticism makes sense. But there's perhaps an indication that physicality is a curse. It seems like it is certainly for the watchers. So in the film, the shackles, the word shackles, I think, is used to describe the angels taking on a corporeal nature.
Mm-hmm.
And not even really a nature, just almost like a suit. So it's almost this idea that that people say, we're not a body having a spiritual experience. We're a spirit having a bodily experience or whatever. Or you are a spirit, you are a soul. You're not a body. That kind of thing.
Well, I think the actual way the Watcher's punishment is portrayed in I don't know which book it is, because I'm not that well versed in it, but the way that the Watcher's punishment is portrayed is that they are kept in shackles under the earth, and I think
in Enoch,
and I think that this movie kind of interprets that, as them being encased in earth,
Yeah, well, and I think Jude specifically uses the language of being kept in chains. But I actually, if you go back to the first book of Enoch, chapter 10, I thought this was interesting, because I wondered if this possibly the whole idea of the watchers being encased in rock or whatever is a midrash on First Enoch 10.
Mm-hmm.
Because it says that the Lord said to Raphael, the angel Raphael, bind Azazel, who's represented as sort of one of the ringleaders of the watchers and the horrible things they do, bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the desert and cast him therein, and place upon him rough and jagged rocks, and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever, and cover his face that he may not see light.
Yeah.
And so they are, rough and jagged rocks are placed upon them, and their light is sort of covered up or hidden or extinguished by these rocks. And so I wondered if perhaps, the film was sort of doing a midrash on that by,
and this is why I'm not mad at Aronofsky, for making so my wife, April, and my mother-in-law, Wolfie's grandma, hate this movie.
Okay.
They cannot stand this movie. Well, they're both evangelical Christians, because it is so different from what they read in Noah, in Genesis, but
it is not different necessarily from what the apostles read when they read Enoch and referenced it. At least as and I'm not saying that the apostles thought Enoch was scripture, but they certainly thought that there were object lessons that you could get from this sort of take on Genesis that isn't strictly what Genesis said. That
you've got Peter and Jude both referencing the book of Enoch.
Mm-hmm.
So that those authors read this book, and knew its contents, and that they were talking to people who knew it as well.
Yeah.
So
and they seem to think you could make theological points on it. So the sin of Aronofsky is the quote unquote sin of Aronofsky is the sin of Peter and Jude.
So here you have, I don't know, I think I heard that Aronofsky himself is not a religious believer.
I read somewhat where someone said that, but when I read an interview with him, I think he noted at the very least his Jewish background and his acknowledgement. I don't know that he necessarily fits neatly into any particular Jewish tradition, but he seemed to be acknowledging that was he spiritually, not just racially, but spiritually identified as Jewish. But
he is Jewish. His co-author, who worked on this movie with him, is also Jewish. He's but anyway, he's not a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
He made a Old Testament biblical movie from a Jewish perspective. And I think using a Jewish, form of biblical exposition, a midrash. I just think this is why I'm not mad at him, because he takes, he wasn't just drawing from Genesis, he was drawing from other Jewish traditional sources.
Mm-hmm.
And he was applying a technique that is legitimate in the community, and he was taking the story seriously, and he was presenting it as I think a real thought experiment about grace and mercy, and coming up with some really good spiritual things to talk about.
Yeah, and yeah, I agree with that. I was going to say, I do think I was thinking about the idea that the angels are referred to as being made of light, and it made me think of the idea of the shattered vessels and the that you kind of find in Kabbalah, and you see that a little bit. So actually, first of all, there's a mineral that the people, the tribe of the people of Cain or whatever, the line of
Zohar.
Cain. Zohar,
Yeah.
and of course, Zohar is the name of a book on Kabbalistic teaching. I think literally means like splendor or radiance.
Mm-hmm.
And Zohar also speaks of Adam and Eve having a celestial luster, which is, they're sort of portrayed briefly in the film as they don't exactly look like beings of light. They look physical, but they do have that what they call a celestial luster. So I do think there's this, certainly a Kabbalistic influence that's there, which once again, I mean, he's coming from a Jewish perspective. It's not necessarily inappropriate. But I do think there's a suggestion, if not something that's explicit, that corporeality is not ideal.
Yeah.
Which I think, which is, what we would call in from a Christian perspective, kind of a Gnosticism. And, that kind of perspective, I think, if taken to its logical conclusion, would undermine the reality of the incarnation of Christ and the possibility of the atonement.
Yeah. And I think, I don't think he was making this movie for Christians, No,
I don't think so either. But we are talking about analyzing it from a theological perspective and seeing what we can get out of it.
One thing I like to do, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and one I listen to, there's a couple of Orthodox Jewish podcasts that I listen to, and one thing I've discovered is that there is this kind of when I went to seminary, we talked a lot about how the Greek influence, kind of the whole matter and spirit kind of thing, influenced Christianity, some Christian groups in a Gnostic sort of way. But that was also present within Judaism. And one thing I noticed is that from the Orthodox perspective, especially ones that are open to like the Kabbalah and stuff like that, you have this separation of spirit and matter, and the matter is physicality is a place where kind of like sin happens, and that spirituality is about so Kabbalah, there's the idea of the infinite light is the highest level of Kabbalah. There's the tree of life that's like the symbol of Kabbalah, the 10 sephirot. At the top of this, I'd say image, graphic kind of like chart, is the representation of God. Above the tree of life is like this infinite light where God dwells in his perfection. And then what you have is successive layers on the way down of solidification until at the very bottom, I think it's Malkuth. The bottom Sephiroth
Hmm.
um, is like the physical world,
Hmm.
and so you have this kind of separation of like, as you're more spiritual, as you get more spiritual, it's less physical, and as you get further down, you know, the more you are controlled by passions and desires and stuff like that. Um, but I
Right.
think that's also very influenced by Gnosticism. Uh, in a way, it's kind of like, I think, um, I kind of see like Judaism and Christianity as like two competing uh, inheritors of where do we take this faith in God after the temple is destroyed.
Hmm.
You know, the 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 practice of worshiping God that was founded by God Himself, temple worship and stuff, has been done away with. So now Christians believe that we are to carry on in faith through following Jesus, whereas the Judaism came up with another answer. Rabbinic Judaism believes that it's by following Torah,
Hmm.
that we around the life of the synagogue.
Hmm. And
And
that prayers, for example, will take the place of sacrifice.
yes, prayers take the place of sacrifice. In fact, um, one of the podcasts, a rabbi was talking about how uh, the Jewish people are actually in the process of obeying the law. They are saving the world.
Hmm.
You know, um, So basically, when they do their mitzvot, they are they are redeeming humanity.
Hmm.
Um, well, anyway, yeah, there's those two paths, and about where do we take faith in God after the destruction of the temple, and within the family of Judaism, you know, Kabbalah is one of the traditions, and I think that was influenced and grew out of the connection of Greek thought and kind of mystery type
Hmm.
stuff, mystery traditions in the Greek world. Uh, that kind of got adopted into that line, and then
Hmm.
I think within Orthodox Christianity anyway, you have this maintained this idea of the goodness of physicality, the goodness of the creation.
Hmm. Well, it's interesting to me that where the point at which Christians, um, a lot of fundamentalist Christians, saw this film and did not take issue is the point at which, first of all, where there is a theological problem that is more subtle, for one thing. It's not anything that's super explicit, but it's also the point at which evangelical Christianity, at least in America, I guess, maybe actually perhaps Christianity through the centuries, in a lot of forms, is perhaps at its most confused. Basically, the real central theological problem that could exist in this film is its dichotomy of the spiritual and the physical. But that's
Mhm.
the same dichotomy that the church has, although technically dealing with it, in its renunciation of Gnosticism. It's been a problem for us, and it's such a big problem because it's the only problem that can completely undermine the atonement.
Yeah.
And but it's not the issue that we noticed in the film, really, and brought to the forefront. We were too concerned about the fact that, well, in the Bible, God tells Noah to take dictation, and that doesn't happen in the movie.
Yeah.
I mean, there weren't rock monsters in the Bible.
No rock monsters. Noah was not a mass murderer. Um, and um, what's all this vegetarian stuff?
Yeah, and Tubal Cain didn't get on the ark. It's all this sort of nitpicky stuff.
Well, and one of the one things actually was a couple of people said to me was they really took offense that the rock monster angels referred to God as the creator. They said they don't talk about God. They don't say God. They say the creator. And there was something really nefarious about the fact that they referred to them as the creator. And I'm like, but he was the creator.
Yeah. But yeah, the part that offended me most in the movie was when Noah writes out a Christmas card and writes Merry Xmas or Happy Holidays.
Yeah. I had a Greek teacher who when he would write on the board, he would write Xian for Christian. And he said, it's okay that I do this because this is the Greek letter key.
Yeah. So if you have a Jesus fish on your car, which is the what's the term when we put the letters together to spell out a word? An acronym, maybe? No, yeah. The acronym for Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior. The X in the ik or the chi, which is written as looks like an X. Yeah. So if you've ever had a Jesus fish on your car, you can't complain if somebody says Merry Xmas.
Yes.
Great. Well, do you have any concluding thoughts that you'd like to end with before we go?
Excuse the coughing.
Well, how about this?
It's hard to tie it all up and put a bow on it, Yeah.
Well, would you recommend the movie for somebody for dealing with these issues? I mean, I felt that it was somewhat unique in dealing so openly and honestly with some of these theological issues in a way that was very down to earth.
Well, okay, and there was so much attention to detail, and you kind of miss that if you think that the movie was just going wild with adding things in the story of Noah that weren't there. It was so meticulous that, like, in a lot of movies, they either don't touch on the fact about like Noah got drunk and was naked and was covered up by his sons and all that, by Ham saw him, and either it doesn't show it, or if it does show it, there's no explanation. Why is Noah getting drunk? Wasn't he an obedient, godly person? You don't know where this came from. It's just something that happens to him. Whereas this movie actually gives a really plausible reason for so many things in the Noah story, including his getting drunk afterwards. I mean, the guy had been through hell, and tried to kill his grandchildren, and ultimately didn't, and thinks that he failed God because he didn't kill them, and he's depressed, and he's first thing, after he gets off the ark, he goes and lives off separately from his family, and he gets drunk every day, and it's like, wow, something must have happened to Noah to make him like that. And this actually gives it ties these details of the narrative together and uses them in this story in a really believable way, and also just I thought that the scene where they were like inside the ark and it was all closed up, and the floods of the water was bursting up from the ground and coming down from the sky, and all the people were outside screaming, and I thought, I actually kind of got like some chills at that moment. And I was thinking, no movie ever portrayed the horror of all these in such a usually it's if you do see it, it's in kind of like they got what they deserved kind of way, whereas here they're showing Noah and his family inside hearing these screams, and some of them are like, we should do something, And Noah's like, there's no saving them, and that that's true. And yeah, it's just kind of chilling. It's all these little details that Aronofsky picks up on and works into the story and ties them all together in a really believable way.
Well, yeah, and maybe one more thing to finish on. You talked about all the details that come in there. I kind of liked that they spent so much attention to the dimensions of the ark.
Yeah.
And whereas every painting or representation of the ark you've ever seen, it looks like a ship. It doesn't look like a big box, which is what it was. I mean, we talk about the Ark of the Covenant; it's a big box, and that's what this was.
And it was ugly.
Yeah.
It was not a beautiful boat. It didn't look like Ken Ham's art.
Yeah. It wouldn't look very good in a medieval painting either.
No.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, Mike, I really appreciate you coming on and doing this with me. I'm really excited about getting this one cleaned up and put online, because I think it'll be a really exciting one to have done. So I'm glad we got an opportunity to do this.
Thanks for asking me. I had a lot of fun.
Thanks, Mike.